Welcome to the Botswana webinar, and without further ado, Professor Stephen Volz, we would love to hear what you have to say. Thank you all for being here, and as we go along, if you have questions that come up that are pertinent to where Stephen's at in the presentation, we are happy to address those questions. We'll keep an eye on them. Otherwise, make sure to jot down your questions, and Professor Volz will address them at the end of the webinar. So thank you, Professor Stephen Volz, for being here, and for all of you for tuning in wherever you may be across the country or the Midwest. And Stephen, you can take the floor.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm honored to have this opportunity. I must say at the outset, this is my first webinar, so I apologize if things seem awkward or strange. It seems strange for me to be speaking to my own computer screen. It feels a little crazy. But anyways, yeah, so what I see in the next half hour, my three basic goals. One is to say just sort of some introductory things about the country of Botswana, about its geography, its history, its culture. Second goal, an overlapping goal, is to raise a few themes, or to discuss a few themes, issues, questions that will be part of the course that I'll be teaching next spring for the ACM program, a course that I've titled tentatively Urban Africa, which will be looking at the role that cities have played, urban areas have played in African history, and more recently in Africa as vehicles of development, social change, and so forth. And so, yeah, so Gaborone serves as a good venue for such a course because you'll be living in a rapidly growing city in southern Africa. And then the third goal I have is then to say a little bit about the program itself, about what, for those of you who are thinking of enrolling in the program, what are some of the basic features of the program, and then after that, then open it up to questions to what other people might have. So with that, I should say as well, by way of introduction, I teach here at Kenyon College in Ohio. I'm in the history department. I teach primarily African history. But I'm also heavily involved in Kenyon's international studies major. I'm currently serving as the director of that program. And then my involvement with ACM's program actually goes back several years, even though I'll be the director for the first time next spring. Actually, I was involved back in the planning of the program back, or whatever it was, 7 years ago, and then have served in other capacities, advising and consulting and so forth. And so for me, I'm really looking forward to this opportunity to serve as the director of this program that I've been sort of watching and helping to nurture along the way. And so I'm really looking forward to this. And the reason for, I think, why I was played a role in the planning and the development of the program earlier was because I myself have a long experience in Botswana. My first experience in the country was as a Peace Corps volunteer directly out of college. Back in ancient days, 30 years ago now. 1985 was when I graduated from college, and then I was stationed in a village in Botswana in 1986 and 87, teaching at a community junior secondary school, teaching science. And so it was then 10 years after that that I began to pursue graduate studies in history and made Southern Africa my specialty with a particular focus on Tswana society during the 19th century. And so subsequently, I have returned to Botswana almost every year to conduct research, to visit with colleagues, to attend conferences and so forth. So for me, this is a wonderful opportunity to be a director of a program and to sort of show off, my favorite country in Africa. So with that lengthy introduction, let me just start off by, so big villages and small cities. So I've got here some pictures of a village on the top of Machuti and the city of Gaborone at the bottom half of the screen there. And the point of that being is to point out, well, the relationship between rural and urban areas in Botswana, and to some extent, I'm sure by extension, other parts of the continent, but really within Botswana and what I would call Tswana society, I think there's a tendency, a sort of a misperception that economic change, social change is centered in cities, and that the villages are sort of these peripheral, quote-unquote, traditional, static areas where nothing ever happens, when in fact the opposite is true, and certainly in Botswana, and that historically the so-called villages have been the largest population centers, and that the idea of a city is really in some ways a new idea, or the type of city you have today. But let me just keep on going here. Let's see if it'll let me. There we go. So first a little bit about Botswana's size. So here you see a map of Midwest, I think there's a common misperception that Africa is some small place over there someplace, and that it's one place. But it's important to keep in mind that Africa is a very large continent with tremendous diversity. It's not one place, but many different places, and you can see how large Botswana is compared to the Midwest. So it's about 3 times the size of Minnesota, or about the same size as Texas or France. And so with only a population of about 2 million people, you can see it's rather sparsely populated. The geography, if we go a little further, here's a map showing you the vegetation zones of Africa. And Botswana, if you see my cursor, is down here in the southern part of the continent. And with the kind of vegetation you'll see represented there is savanna, grassland, steppe, semi-desert. The western half of the country is dominated by what's called the Kalahari Desert, but it's not really a true desert because it gets enough rainfall to sustain grasses and thorn trees and thorn bushes. And so while you might have some sand underneath all that, you do have vegetation on top of it. So I think it's more accurate to regard it as steppe, really. I also note that Botswana is about as far south of the equator as Mexico is north of the equator, which means it's subtropical. I mean, the Tropic of Capricorn passes right through the middle of the country. And so one result of that is it gets pretty hot in the summer, but because of the dryness of the climate and its altitude, it's about, or its elevation, it's about 3,000 feet above sea level, is it can get pretty chilly in the winter. It just gets down below freezing. But during the time of the spring semester program, it'll be very hot at the beginning, and it will gradually cool off to, I don't know, probably 60s and 70s during the day by May time. So a few images of Botswana countryside to give you a sense of the, quote-unquote rural society or traditional society. Here's a typical farm in Botswana, showing you the family, their goat crawl sorghum field that they've recently plowed, awaiting the summer rains to water the crops. Sorghum is the staple food in Botswana. I think here in the United States we tend to think of sorghum as a syrup or a molasses, but actually that's sorghum is a grain. And being a semi-arid environment, acacia thorn trees are ubiquitous, and you'll see here an example of one of those. And a closer view of the tree indicates the thorns, the protective thorns that it has, which of course you have to be careful about. Being a tropical area or subtropical, it also has rainy seasons and dry season. Rain falls only during the summer, and in the rainy season really just means that you have rainfall maybe once a week or so, or scattered thunder showers. But they show you some images that you don't, even though you might have thunder clouds, you don't always have rain. And this is a saying in Setswana, "Maruha tsepula," clouds are not rain. I suppose analogous to the English saying, don't count your chickens before they're hatched. Just because you see rain clouds doesn't mean it's going to drop rain. Here shows some women pounding the staple, the grain, sorghum, into flour, which then will be cooked into a thick porridge called bohobe, which is the staple food of Botswana traditionally. This is actually at a primary school in the village of Tamaha, and so these women are donating their labor to process the government-supplied grain into the flour, and then it will be served as lunch for the school children. Another typical scene in the countryside, a family renovating the farmhouse. They've demolished the old sort of adobe walls and replaced them with new ones, and then now are reconstructing the roofing and the poles and the thatch you see piled on the left there. And once a house is finished, this is another typical house. Pretty durable walls. I mean, the walls are made out of a mixture of sand, clay, and cow manure, and it produces a pretty hard, durable material. And then they see the roofing there, and the children warming themselves in the winter sun. Inside one of those houses, a dirt floor, but it's usually been hard packed and sometimes smeared with manure to give it a glossy sheen. This one is a little bit dirty, but they're cooking inside here using a customary 3-legged iron pot and a homemade chair. And then this helps to illustrate, as I referenced earlier, the dry season and the wet season on the left during the winter and on the right during the summer. These are images that I took while I was a Peace Corps volunteer living there out the front door of my hut as I'm looking across the yard of the family who I was staying with. So now I want to turn a little bit to the culture and the history of Botswana, or the Tswana society. This is a image taken from a map that shows you some of the linguistic diversity of the continent, focusing on southern Africa, so you can see the boundaries of modern-day Botswana. And as I'm sure but in fact, the numbers of people, there's probably twice as many people in South Africa who speak the language of Setswana than there are within the country of Botswana. So, and then even if you take it to Sotho, these languages here are presumably different, but in fact they're very closely related to Setswana and arguably are mutually comprehensible, so that they're, one could say they're even dialects of a larger language. And the result being that the main language spoken over the entire, this large swath of southern Africa is Sotho-Tswana, and knowledge of Setswana will enable you to communicate with people in certainly the rural areas and to some extent the urban areas throughout the northwestern, segment of South Africa, as well as most of Botswana. So this is first languages. Keep in mind that virtually everyone in Botswana can speak Setswana as a second language, and usually English as a third language. If they're over here, I should say as well, just the majority of the people in Botswana live in the eastern part of the country, so that in fact, even though this green color only covers a few areas, about 80% of the people in Botswana speak Setswana as their first language. But then everyone learns English in primary school and secondary school. This is more of a historical map, again, kind of representing where the Sotho-Tswana areas are, and these other names here are for what might be termed chiefdoms or nations or tribe, although I have the term tribe is somewhat problematic because it has all kinds of connotations that are generally inaccurate for groups in Africa. So I tend to prefer the term chiefdom. And here's some of the vocabulary you should be familiar with for understanding Tswana history. Tswana is sort of a root word, an adjectival root word. Setswana, I mean Tswana language and culture. Botswana, it means literally Tswana people. A Kosi is a chief, king, or headman. Morafe is a chiefdom or tribe. The Kotla is the courtyard or ward or area where the chief meets with people in the village. The Motse is the village or community. And then here's a term that is more to the point of my class, and that is this toropo, which is a word in Setswana, but it's derived from the Afrikaans word dorp. Dorp, which means town. And it's interesting how that word entered the Setswana language as Europeans began to build their communities in the region. And so the word toropo was used to describe a European-built community, essentially. But then ultimately becomes part of Setswana language and culture in some interesting ways during the 20th century. And I'll get back to that in a minute. That's the one point I want to make about, referencing the title of this talk, Big Villages, is that historically the Tswana society has had unusually large so-called villages, communities, that the population of the largest ones in the early 19th century and presumably earlier than that, and it would reach 20,000, 30,000 people, which would make them larger than any of the European-built towns in southern Africa at that time. Cape Town at that time maybe had 15,000 or 20,000 people. So even though you see these conventional maps of southern Africa in the 19th century, and they show you the European-built communities, but if they're going to more accurately represent where people were living, in fact, the Tswana communities were much more populous, and there was several dozen of them that each had populations of more than 10,000 people. And like I said, the largest ones reached 20 to 30,000 people. And this is showing you an aerial photo and an archaeological drawing of one of those sites in South Africa. But you can see how these are all representing stone walls, so clusters of houses around sort of chiefly royal enclosures and so forth, which requires a lot more explanation, but to suffice with that for now. This is showing you more archaeological drawings from that same site at Maratodi, zeroing in on just the central chiefly homestead. So now you see here each of these is one of these huts or round houses, and each family has its own little enclosure, but they're all clustered around the central enclosure. And then the chief's dwellings are usually among the larger ones. But then you would have, going back to the previous slide, you see this is just the chiefly enclosure, but you can see that all these other chiefly lineage, all these other lineages, clans have clustered around, and so that's the general process whereby these communities were formed, is you would have other lineages and clans would pay allegiance to this a chiefly lineage, and so by sort of this, you have this conglomeration or confederation of different clans, and as more and more joined, you could really reach rather large populations. So some drawings help illustrate this. This was when European explorer William Burchell visited in 1812 this one a community called Ditakong, which at the time was the capital of the Batlapeng, which was a chiefdom of Botswana chiefdom during the early 19th century. And you can see, yeah, they estimated the population was almost 30,000 people. And so they were really astounded coming from little Cape Town to this large community in the interior of Southern Africa, and so they, and so they drew it. And so you can see the huts just extend off into the horizon, and it's just these one cluster of huts after another with these different clans that emerge together. Another example is here in Molopolole, in Swang, up on the hilltop of just immediately south of the modern-day village of Molopolole. But this is a drawing, again, made by a European visitor in 1865. But you can see, again, it just shows you some of the housing, which actually extends. It was more crowded and more populous than you can even see from this. And this was the chief's central kraal here. And just, I think, real briefly, since I don't want to run out of time, this shows you, again, some of the main chiefdoms during the 19th century. And the reason I show this, again, is to show you, historically the significance of history, and that is, now you went to the colonial period, you'll see these are some of the major chiefdoms, and sort of the British during the colonial period, 1885 to 1966, so tried to continue some of the chiefly authority, and did so, as you can indicate by this map, with each of these so-called native reserves, or whatever they would sort of delegate the authority of the local chiefs to over territory that coincided with their earlier chiefdoms. But of course, the British tried to regularize it more and to create formal boundaries between these chiefdoms. But that's what this was meant to do. And now you can see this further illustrated in modern Botswana. How, and this is where I'm getting to the point of this history, and how the modern provinces of Botswana closely coincide with what had been the sort of the colonial reserves, which in turn closely coincided with the earlier chiefdoms and clans. And so there's a certain amount of continuity in Tswana society in a sense of how political authority is constituted, what gives a local government legitimacy, and where do people live. So those major capitals of those old chiefdoms, Sorowe, Molopolole, Kanye, Muchudi, and there's some other ones, were until the 1980s the most populous communities in modern-day Botswana. The city of Gaborone was really a new innovation. It was something that was not built until after independence, and it only very gradually achieved the prominence that it has today. This shows you where they just, one reason they decided to put Gaborone here is it did not belong to any of the existing chiefdoms, the Bakwena, Bakatla, Bangwaketse. These were the major centers of population and authority prior to independence, and so the whole story of Gaborone's growth parallels that of the growth of Botswana's national government. It becomes the capital of the new country, and as the population grows and as the government exercises its authority from the capital city, it sort of gradually supersedes the authority and significance of these chiefly capitals, which even today are still 30,000, 40,000 people, but Gaborone, while it was only about 50,000 people in the 1980s, now has reached a population of more than 200,000. This map shows you at the time that they were working towards independence, so this was the idea of how they were going to build this city on essentially empty ground that didn't belong to any of the chiefdoms, and deliberately so. They saw it as neutral, in some ways analogous with Washington, D.C. It was deliberately built in a place that didn't belong to any of the states. Similarly, Gaborone was built on this land here. But then, as you can see from this Google Earth image, Gaborone today, as seen from a satellite, has extended quite much further. Sorry, let me get this. Here's that old map showing you what they anticipated would be the extent of it, adjacent to the village of Tloqueng, which was the chiefly capital of the Batlokwa people. But in reality, and so you can see the roads still line up. I mean, they did follow that original plan, but what happened was, as the city grew much faster and further than they expected, what's happened particularly in the 80s and 90s and continuing today, is they've had to add all of these other neighborhoods, and they've essentially assimilated the village here of Mokaditsani, the village of Khabani over here, so it continues to grow as people move further away from the city center and producing significant traffic jams at rush hour. But yeah, so my point with the title of this talk is that, that Gaborone starts off as very much a small city, and insignificant in many respects, and people regarded it as Toropo. They saw it as a desert, regarded it as almost a European conceived space, and it didn't really belong to them. It took a couple generations for the people of Botswana to really embrace Gaborone as their own, rather than their own major chiefly capitals. And so that's, I guess, the basic lecture, mini lecture I'm giving you to sort of anticipate some of the themes that will come up, and how Botswana and Gaborone in particular fits into this larger history of villages and cities in Africa. Let me make sure I'm not forgetting anything. Yes. So the next part of this, and I see I still have some time. Good, is to talk now about more generally how does Gaborone fit into the development of Botswana, and this is more broadly about the country itself. I mean, one thing that's really significant about Botswana is it's really is seen as one of the most peaceful, stable, and prosperous countries in Africa. And so that's another basic question to explore in this program and just in visiting Botswana is, what's the secret of their success? How and why is this development proceeded? These numbers are meant to illustrate, provide you some data, some evidence of that rapid economic growth. You can see changes in population, changes in GNP per capita, fertility rate accordingly declines as people's standard of living increases. More doctors available, percentage of people living in the city increases, 31% by 2000. Paved roads, miles of paved roads rapidly increased. That was a major area of growth, as well as in schooling. You can see the number of secondary schools went from 58 to 265 in just 15 years. It's really a remarkable growth. And the main reason for that, really two things. One is diamonds, the discovery of diamonds. Botswana produces probably about a third to a half of the world's gem diamonds. And at the same time, democracy, because they have a democratic government, and just mineral wealth alone would not explain their success. Other countries in Africa have more mineral wealth, but democracy has meant that mineral wealth has been distributed and used wisely by the government to promote economic development, and has been used to develop the country. So here are just a few images now to illustrate some of that development. And how the development has not been confined to the capital city. What happened is it gets that wealth as people graduate from school and they get a job in the government as a teacher or clerk in some business or what have you. One of the first things they do is they put that money into the housing and the development of their home villages. And really, again, going back to my point about Toropo, I mean, most people in Botswana until recently, really, if you ask them where home was, they wouldn't say Gaborone, they would say their home village. And everyone would go home on the weekends and so forth. It's changing now. You do have your first generation now, people born and raised in Gaborone. But this shows you some of that development in this particular yard, which I was most familiar with. It's where I lived with this family in Botswana. So you can see here, 10 years later, how they used their money to replace the dirt walls with cement walls and the older style thatch with the newer style thatch and the wall here. And they bought themselves a pickup truck. Here's the family themselves. I won't go into too many particulars. This was their family posing for me in 1987 as I was about to leave Botswana. The father, Jonas, the mother, Betty. Jonas worked in the South African gold mines at the time and only was able to visit home about twice a year. But the children all managed to graduate from secondary school and even a couple of them from college. And this is the same family, several years, 13 years later. I won't go through all their stories, but just because I realize I'm running short on time. But all of them have benefited from this economic growth for the most part. I mean, Morisautsile Upametse is working as in their version of the Internal Revenue Service. Others are working as grade school teachers. Montusi actually works at the Immigration Service, is currently stationed in Delhi in India. Yeah, I think I should keep going. And then here's some pictures of the village of Tamaha, showing you a sequence. I've got 4 pictures that shows you how dramatically it grew as people invested in their home village to distribute this development. So this is 87. Take a look for point of reference here. For example, this building here, you can see they built a cement-walled hut, but they don't have the money yet for the roof. So 10 years later, same scene. They put on a roof, painted their building white, added another building, put some hedges in. You can see other buildings that are changing. 5 years later, and 8 years later. So if you do that sequence again, yeah. So I mean, if you looked at every single one of these compounds, you'd see some evidence of economic development, as well as the village itself. Infrastructure, they now paved roads, electricity in most compounds, a police station. There's a clinic over on the other side of the hill over here. Other before and after shots. Here's the school where I taught in image in 1986. Here was their lunch program. That stuff you saw being pounded earlier in this presentation has been cooked into this thick porridge, and the students here are distributing it amongst themselves, about to eat it with some soup on top. The same school 10 years later has a more refined cafeteria, if you will, a more greater variety of foods, and it's indoors. In that previous scene, the students just kind of ate outside. Here shows the library of the same school in 1987, and 10 years later, the government supplied, well, at this time in 97, it was a big deal, having a TV and VCR, a pull-down screen for showing films, encyclopedias, other reference books, and obviously, you know, bursting at the seams with new books. So again, here, the only books at that time, this is when I was there, was a few books that had been donated by foreign agencies and actually were rather inappropriate for Botswana. Books on wheat growing in Saskatchewan, limited usefulness. So now, infrastructure. 1987, here's a typical road in Botswana in the rural areas, generally unpaved, and so when you have a stream that floods after a rainfall, then everyone has to stop and wait for the water to go down. Road across the Kalahari Desert in 1987, just a sand track. You needed 4-wheel drive in order to traverse the desert. That same road, however, several years later, 20 years later, is completely paved, and now you can fly along it, and what used to take 2 days, now you can do in maybe 8 hours. And then the roads, just one obligatory wildlife shot here, is also an important part of Botswana's economic development, is the development of the tourist industry in the northern part of the country, is where they have tremendous concentrations of wildlife, and so there's a lot of game viewing there, and this is just one example of that in Shobe National Park, elephants and Cape buffalo. And tourists going to pay their money to see these wildlife. So now moving to Gaborone. This is actually, I took a group of students back when I was a Peace Corps volunteer on a field trip to the National Parliament and to the National Slaughterhouse. That's the Botswana Meat Commission. Here are some goats being disassembled. Grocery store in Gaborone, where now today, yeah, they have well-stocked supermarkets. You can buy all kinds of things in the city. Here's a scene. They did have one American fast food restaurant back in the 80s. This is the same one now, 10 years after that. The downtown scene in 2002. I mean, I don't have a good after shot here, but the downtown has grown significantly, and a lot of these empty spaces have been filled in with more shopping malls and other kinds of buildings. Here's the city bus station, which 30 years ago was simply a dirt parking lot with a big shade tree, and now it's this huge complex. And the diamond sorting building, again, the national diamond production used to be sorted and used to profit primarily foreign cutters and polishers, and now they're moving some of that into the country itself. And here's a picture of me with one of my former students, just to illustrate this move to the big city. One of my former students from Tamaha currently works in the library at the University of Botswana, and this statue is from a story that, again, I think illustrates this idea of the big village, and that is when they first built the university, they did so using funds generated from the donation of cattle, so that each family was donated a cow, and then the proceeds from the sale of those cows established the money needed to start building the university. So to commemorate that event, they have this statue in front of the library at the University of Botswana. So I took this picture just this past summer. So ACM's program is based at the University of Botswana, and it's through this program that you learn more about Gaborone and about rural-urban connections. This shows you the the calendar for the program. The first half of the semester with a break in between, mid-semester break, and then basically take 4 courses. One is in Setswana language. A second one is one you enroll in a course offered by the University of Botswana, and there's a whole range of courses for that. The third is the course I'll be teaching, which is on urban Africa, which I've already mentioned. And the fourth is an independent study project, which you'll do in consultation with me, but basically you choose a topic and conduct research on it and then produce a paper and a presentation at the end of the semester. Also, students live in the University of Botswana dormitories. The mid-semester break, we take a trip to the northern part of the country to see some wildlife, but there's also field trips in the area, and I plan to include some trips to some of these major villages to help illustrate some of what I've just been talking about, the contrasts and the connections between Gaborone and these major old chiefly capitals. Some images of the University of Botswana, which I just took this last summer. Here shows you some of the buildings. This shows you the dormitory where students in the ACM program stay, affectionately called Las Vegas by the Botswana students, who, when it was built, it was clearly a nicer dorm, and now I would say it's just an average dorm. And this is another image of the campus showing you the Student Center, which is in that building where the International Studies office is, so that's where ACM students will have some meetings and things. That's also where the bookstore is. And to close then, I have this one a YouTube video to show you, I guess, what I would call sort of village activities on the campus. This is a demonstration, student protests demonstrations in 2012 at University of Botswana. What they're protesting, well, a number of things. One of the things they were protesting was it had to do with exam policies and some other things, but I think rather than go into that, I'll just kind of show a few minutes of this to show you some of the University of Botswana students who will be some of the main part of your experience in the ACM program is interacting with these students, and here they are demonstrating. See if this works. I'm just going to skip it a little bit more. think that's all I have. So I think, yeah, 35 minutes. Now we'll open it up to questions, I believe.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor Volz. That was fantastic, and we appreciate the chance to learn more about Botswana, and thank you for sharing your expertise. At this point, we would open it up for questions. So if everybody can see the little question panel. Yeah, excellent. So, oh, hello. And so now if you can see Stephen to answer the questions too. So we have one question that says, what is the context of that video that we just viewed?
Yeah, there was students at University of Botswana were protesting a number of things in January of 2012. Among their leading grievances was there had prior to that time been a policy if students failed an examination, they'd have an opportunity to take a makeup exam, and the school was considering ending that policy. I believe it was also something that had to do with the raising of some tuition. There was some money issues as well. But I think primarily what was aggravating the students is that the administration was not involving the student government in those decisions at all. Because what happened subsequent to this demonstration is actually the leaders of the student, like the student government group, they were dismissed from the school, which then provoked an even larger and more rambunctious demonstration that in fact was met by a police force. And so what's happening here is the students it's with an earlier demonstration that was relatively peaceful and exuberant, and they're sort of anticipating they'll have their demands met, but in fact they were not, and so that led to more activity.
Excellent. Thank you for that insight. It's cool to see the different ways that students engage civically on that campus. We have another question. So we got a little bit of a taste of it today, but it says, can you give some additional info about the course you'll be teaching in spring 2017?
Yeah, so the title of the course tentatively is Urban Africa. I'm not sure how many times a week we'll be meeting, probably 2 or 3 times a week. But the chronological scope, I mean, I'll start the class considering some cases from other parts of the continent as well, but the overall distribution of cases, I mean, probably about 1/3 to 1/2 the class will focus on Southern Africa, but for purposes of contrast, comparison, I'll also include cases from other parts of the continent. But yeah, but I will use start with pre-colonial cases to demonstrate that urbanization is not something that was invented or brought to Africa by Europeans, but there's all kinds of cases, instances of urbanization in Africa that has nothing to do with Europeans. And then we'll look at the colonial period and how colonization sort of in some ways affected sort of indigenous African urbanization in various ways, but also introduced new forms of urbanization. And then ultimately we'll spend probably most of the time on post-colonial urban Africa by looking at comparing different cities, like comparing Johannesburg with Lagos and Nairobi and Kinshasa and so forth, to take a closer look at some of the problems and challenges faced by those African cities and trying to manage their rapidly growing populations, and then throughout then making references to Gaborone as a case of comparison. I don't know what else. I'm happy to answer more questions about it if people have some.
Okay, fantastic. We have a question from a student asking, it says, what are you studying? And so I'm assuming that means like what is your personal research focused on?
Oh, yeah. Well, most of my research, I look at the 19th century and early 20th century Tswana society. I think initially my research was looking at the Africans who worked as teachers and preachers in conjunction with European missionaries. So my interest was in what role did they play within their own communities, what role did Christianity play as it was adopted and adapted by some Africans. And so I was really interested in the process, the role played by these Africans as intermediaries between their own communities and Europeans. More recently, I've been looking at early 20th century and sort of chronologically taking it a little bit later and looking at Africans who were educated in those mission schools. How did they react to European colonization? And then there's a host of issues that arise in that context. If that helps.
Excellent, thank you. We have another question. We have 2 questions. So one one question is, will you be taking students back to the village where you taught when you were in the Peace Corps?
I could. I actually, well, I'm still haven't decided on the field trips. I probably will. I mean, because the other thing I'm considering doing is assigning students to visit these villages on their own. I mean, I'll almost certainly take a field trip with everybody, but then after that, I really want to encourage students to make some of these discoveries on their own, and then for us to reconvene and to talk about our experiences. Because there's several major interesting villages that are, within a few hours drive of Gaborone, and they're pretty easy to reach. But no, certainly I have a friend who runs a small museum in Molopolole, and I anticipate we'll visit that village certainly. And yeah, it would be very easy to visit Tamaja as well. Yeah, but no, that's definitely one of the things I want to add to the program is to utilize my knowledge of all these villages, and so we will. My hope is that students will certainly have a lot of exposure to them.
Excellent, thank you. We have one question that says, I'm interested in learning more about the chiefdom system that you described earlier in the talk. Specifically, how are leaders chosen? What kind of social hierarchies are there?
Yeah. I mean, the chiefs, and I think they're still chosen this way. I mean, with these chiefs, I mean, there is sort of a chiefly lineage, and so some of it is a matter of ancestry and inheritance. But at the same time, it's not necessarily like the European primogeniture system where the oldest son necessarily takes over. So often it can be contested. You might have several sons, or it might be the brother of the deceased chief. It is patriarchal in that predominantly chieftaincy is a male institution, but there's always some negotiation among the elders, basically ultimately make the decision. A group of elders and relatives decide, so it's not just necessarily one person has a right to become the chief. Often they consider as well, who's most qualified, who seems to be best knowledge and has the best character and is best qualified to do so. But more recently, actually just about 5 years ago, the Bamalete in Ramotswa, the chiefdom, a woman inherited the position of chieftaincy for the first time in Botswana. And so, but there is some precedent for that. Oftentimes you did have sort of regions where the mother or the sister of the chief would sort of be the de facto ruler for a number of years, and it could extend for several decades, even if the title of chief, the official title was usually reserved for men. But now in Ramotswa, just recently, that's changed. So the institution itself is susceptible to change and adaptation.
Thank you so much. I think in respect for people's time, the last question that we are going to take is about applying to the program. And so that is something, Stephen, that you can relax on, that Mariah and I will cover a little bit about applying. But one thing that we might ask you to put some input in is the question is, what kind of student do you think would be a best fit for this program?
You want me to answer that now? Or?
Yeah, why don't you do that, and then we'll hop in, and if you are that best fit, we will tell you how to actually apply.
Yeah, well, I think clearly, any student who does off-campus study, and particularly in Africa, must be pretty adventurous and willing to try new things, be flexible. I mean, that's something that I think is common, well, anywhere overseas, but I think particularly in Africa, is things don't always work the way one plans. And so one has to be sort of ready for the possibility. I mean, for example, the University of Botswana, classes might be supposed to start on one day, and you find out, okay, no, they're not going to start for a few more days, or the dorm room that you thought you were going to have, oh no, we're going to have to change. And then or the vehicle we're traveling in gets a flat tire, or there's goats on the road, or what have you. And so yeah, so I think the most basic requirement is a certain amount of flexibility and a good sense of humor to kind of roll with things. Yeah, and just a curiosity, I think, to learn about new places. I can't think of
fantastic.
Other characteristics as well.
Wonderful, thank you. And then we would just say that in terms of the other part of that question was, what do I need to know about applying to this program? And so for students who are tuned in, that application process will vary based on your school, or application deadlines will vary based on your school. And so in terms of applying for spring 2017, make sure to check in with your off-campus study office or your international education office so that you know what the deadline is for applying for this spring 2017 program. Otherwise, the ACM deadline for applying for this program is March 15th. March 15th and
October 15th is also, so we would prefer that you get everything in, particularly because that lets us sort of hold your spot if you apply by the March 15th deadline. Students for whom it's like a longer approval process have until our October 15th deadline, but we always say sort of earlier is better with this. Our application form can be found online, and so that should be hopefully pretty simple. So acm.edu/apply. And so most students, or all students, are required to submit 2 letters of recommendation and a copy of their transcripts as part of the application process, but we'll work with you throughout that to get those in either from the campuses or directly from your recommenders. And so I would say after you're finishing with this talk to go onto the ACM website, and there's a button that says apply now, and you can start filling that out. But our general rule of thumb is that before you do any sort of off-campus study application, to make sure that you talk to your academic advisor to make sure that all of your credits are going to work out, to get things for your major, and then to be talking with your campus's off-campus study office for any sort of specific things that they need you to fill out before that's done.
So those are the general application steps, and you are also welcome to send any questions at all to me. My name is Mariah Wyka, and I've put my email there in the chat form, and so you can also send any questions you have about the program or about this webinar my way, and if I don't have the answer, I'll connect you with somebody who does, and so I'll be a point person for applications and questions in general. Does anybody have any other questions that they'd like to toss into the question box there?
Real fast before we sign off.
Okay, great.
Thank you all so much.
Oh, we have one last question, and I think this is directed. Okay, so for the program, Professor Volz, what do students do for fun on the Botswana program?
Oh. Well, I think a lot of it, since the students are housed on campus, I mean, I think the social life tends to revolve around campus and whatever friends that they make with the Botswana students. I know there is one bar on campus. There's others in walking distance. But actually, a lot of ACM students do get involved with various other extracurricular activities. I mean, there is opportunities for a number of sort of intramural teams, soccer most notably, but also netball, swimming. I think they've also have some dance clubs, where people do ballroom dancing or other things. So I think that, yeah, so all the things you might find at any university campus are also available at University of Botswana. I know, and then the other thing that's part of the program is most students try to find some kind of an internship that can take up a lot of their time. I know students who have volunteered at local grade schools or other sort of, other kind of nonprofit agencies, and they might develop other activities through those. Like they might start just like a couple hours a week, and then they develop relationships with those people, and that leads to invitations to attend a wedding some weekend, and so there's a different ways to get involved. But again, going back to what characteristics of a successful student is, one who's eager and interested in jumping into the deep water and getting to know people. I think clearly we'll have a more rewarding time and a fuller schedule.
Awesome. Thank you so much. On that note, thank you all for attending. It's been awesome to have you all with us today. We really appreciate Professor Volz taking the time to teach us a little bit more about Botswana. I know that I learned a lot during this hour we've had together. As I said again, if you are interested in applying, the website is right there. I put it up in the chat form, and my email is there as well if you have any other questions. We appreciate you taking the time to...
People are welcome to contact me as well, although I can't see how to put my email in there, so if you feel welcome to add my email there as well if somebody was to contact me for any reason.
Fantastic, and we'll send a follow-up that includes Professor Volz's email if you are interested in learning more about Botswana in general or the ACM Botswana program. Thanks again for taking the time to hang out with us today on this webinar, and we hope that you all have a wonderful Friday.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor Volz. Thank you all, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. You
Bye.
too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.